Hello there, Paul Haswell from Pince and Masons Hong Kong here again to talk about technology matters in this week's technology podcast. Now, it is just me again. I am still at home. In fact, myself, most of my colleagues, and it feels like most of Hong Kong, if not most of the world, is probably at home as things are developing. It's been a very, very odd week in the world in general. Most countries, it seems, are in some sort of lockdown as they protect themselves from the coronavirus, avoiding case of COVID-19, and generally making sure that this thing isn't the apocalypse that sometimes it feels the media wants it to be. The only advice I'm going to give on this is if we all stay at home, you all avoid contact, this will get better. We are a pretty sensible species, the human race. This isn't going to be the end of it. I always assumed the end of it would either be alien invasion or perhaps zombies. I would be very upset if it's just essentially a virus that causes horrible flu symptoms that can kill you. Not nearly as exciting, and all of the zombie survival handbooks I've read have been for nothing if that's the case. Anyway, I should stop joking around. I should tell you what I'm going to talk about this week. That is the topic of facial recognition. Now, I assume that you probably have come across facial recognition before. I assume that you know what it is because I will guarantee, unless you have been living in a bunker, which you may have been at the moment, or you've been living under a rock, then at some point you've been subject to facial recognition technology. A scan of your face has been taken, a photo has been taken, and that has gone onto a database and will have been used to identify you. Now, the most likely place where that has been is the airport. If you've passed through a modern airport in the last few years, almost certainly as you've gone through a security gate or you've gone through immigration, a shot of your face has been taken, added to a database, and that will be used to identify who you are. And facial recognition is simply that. Now, it's nothing new. Back in the old days, the simplest form of facial recognition is your passport photo. If you were traveling around in the 60s and 70s, you'd go to a gate, have a hopefully very friendly immigration officer look at your passport. He'd use his own facial recognition using his brain, decide you were who you were supposed to be, and let you in. He may then check some details on his system, depending on what systems they had in the 60s and 70s. I wasn't flying then, that's for sure. Just to see whether there's anything that he should know about that shouldn't let you in, or if you're subject to some restrictions. Now, all of facial recognition technology is taking that, looking at somebody's face, identifying the person, and then seeing what data attaches to it, and bringing it into the 21st century. And given the speed at which technology has moved and the processing capability of these systems, you can do some phenomenal things. Now, I personally am not very good at remembering passwords. I'm not very good at actually remembering everything. If I think about when I leave the house, the chore that I have when I'm trying to go out. So think about what I've got. I've got my keys, obviously, otherwise I can't get back in. I've also got two phones, a work phone and a personal phone, so that's something I've got to hang on to. All about my payment cards in my wallet, my access pass for my home building, my access pass for the office building, and another access pass for the office itself. All of these various items, which means that on every given day I will leave the house, go back again because I've forgotten something, go out, go back again because I've forgotten something else, and I waste a phenomenal amount of time. Think how convenient it is if I can just do everything just by looking at a sensor, by letting a camera identify me. If I could pay all my bills like that, if I could open all my doors like that, if I could go anywhere just by using my face, which is something which, honestly, I've never left the house without. Now, in these times of working from home, I was getting a bit sick of logging into my computer, and I'm a big fan of Face ID on iOS devices. I know I'm always talking about iOS devices. So I bought myself a camera for my Windows PC so I could use Windows Hello. So I no longer have to remember the password. It just looks at my face and logs me in. And that's cool. The convenience that facial recognition offers. Imagine not having to carry around an ID card. Imagine being able to get any service you want just by providing your face. It's pretty exciting stuff, isn't it? And I think that's the trade-off with facial recognition. The convenience factor is something that people don't think, well, what is necessarily the downside? There are so many positive uses, even as far as in the medical industry, where if your medical records are linked to your face, unless you've suffered some awful disfiguring facial injury, most likely people can decide whether you're subject to some sort of requirement that they can't give you certain medicines. You can tell I'm not a doctor, that I'm a lawyer, can't you? If they can make sure that they're not going to give something you're allergic to. Fantastic uses beyond just the everyday convenience factor. Also, in terms of missing persons, suppose someone goes missing, but you've got facial ID, you've got facial recognition cameras around countries, cities around the world. They can track you and figure out who you are and then identify you and tell your family, who are absolutely terrified, where you are and how to get you back. It's a fantastic, marvelous technology. Or is it? Let's be honest. There is, I think, a valid concern that facial recognition technology can go too far. There aren't presently many places that limit how it can be used. I'll come on to privacy issues and data protection in a bit. Some states, I think it was California, though I may be wrong on this, has basically moved to try and restrict and outlaw facial recognition. Other jurisdictions are all in favor of it. If you go to China, facial recognition technology is everywhere. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that China is the leader on facial recognition technology. But how is it being used? The worry is that if you're being tracked all the time, are you losing some sort of your rights? Now, think of this in the concept of just a trip to your local mall. Not that many people are going to malls at the moment, if they're even open. As you go into the building, facial recognition technology takes a scan of your face and it links it to a database because you've been there before or you've signed up to something and it knows who you are. So it's got your personal details. It knows, say, for example, what ethnic group you are. I would probably get that from just the camera alone. It may know who you're related to. It might know the sort of things you buy if it's been using this technology to track you through the mall and looked at shops that you go into. It may know how much you spend by the sort of, are you buying an expensive luxury handbag all the time? Or are you buying, I know you like me, buying video games or records all the time? It may be able to build a profile of you. And that's great, except that what if that profile is, or but maybe you were wanted for some criminal offence years ago where you may not, or you may not even know that you've committed it. I say it was jaywalking somewhere, and it automatically decides to report you to the authorities. Take that a step further, and this is something that is in action in China. If you jaywalk, facial recognition software captures you, just immediately deducts a fine from your WeChat Pay account. There's a whole aspect of it where it's like many technology, it suddenly gets out of your control and you wonder, well, is this actually as great a technology as it should be? Are the benefits actually being outweighed by the risk of misuse? Now, I don't know if you're probably reading lots of books when you still go home, and one of the books that someone always brings up is 1984, where citizens are being tracked, they must report back to Big Brother. There is a fear of a Big Brother society that if you're being watched all the time, everyone knows everywhere you go, then have we lost our personal liberties? Have we lost our freedom? There's another side of this. I said, well, if you've got nothing to hide, why are you worried about this? Which I think is a fairly lousy excuse for the moment. But think of what's going on in China, where facial recognition technology, most famously for me, was used to capture someone who'd been to a pop concert. They were wanted for some sort of crime. I don't think it was a massive crime, but the facial recognition tech caught them in the crowd at a concert. And let's face it, concerts tend to be busy places. Alerted the police came and picked them up. I presume they got to enjoy the rest of the concert before they ended up in the slammer, but who knows? Is that going too far? It's going to really depend on the spectrum of where you sit on personal liberties versus the law versus, cool, this is exciting new technology. And it's a tricky one to answer. Now, that's essentially, in many ways, that is the use of facial recognition technology at state levels. I mean, people worry about states having too much power, too much control, but it has a massive amount of uses in the commercial sector, in the retail sector I already hinted at. Generally day to day, think of it, if you can use facial recognition technology to link your face to a customer. If you're in retail selling, for example, beauty products, you could use it to try and create profiles of people, making sure that they buy the right things. For access to buildings, it's very useful. For security purposes, rather than having everyone write down lots of passwords in a notebook and leave them on their desk for them to get stolen, if you use someone's face, then in theory, it should be quite hard to clone it. There's lots of debate as to whether you could just show a photo of someone's face and that would work, but facial recognition technology is advancing at such a level that actually it's a lot more detail than that. I mean, Face ID on Apple phones, for example, works in pitch black room. It uses a completely different way of scanning, as indeed does Windows Hello, which is this very convenient thing that I'm now looking at the camera there going, is it monitoring my every move and sending it to Microsoft? I don't know. Hopefully it's not. But there are a massive amount of uses. The problem is, data privacy law, and I don't want this to become a purely data protection talk, but data privacy law varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now, I mentioned in California the move to try and restrict the use of facial recognition tech. In many jurisdictions, much of whether you can collect facial recognition data depends on whether that data counts as personal data. Now, I would argue it is. If you take the definition from the GDPR, which is a very wide-ranging definition, including biometric data, then your face is personal data. In fact, if you don't take that, if you just take pure logic, surely your face and what you look like is some of the most personal data you could possibly have. So in most jurisdictions, you would have to deal with the data privacy laws to make sure you can engage facial recognition technology in the first place. Now, we've done some work for people who've wanted to impose it in buildings, in shared offices, and the question they often come down to is, one, do they need consent to use facial recognition systems? And two, is there a way around that consent? Because often the answer to question one is yes, you do need consent. And how do you obtain consent when you're passively taking a picture of someone and adding it to a facial recognition database? How do you actually make that work? The workaround we've often used is some sort of notice saying that if you enter this building, your data will be collected. But even then, you don't necessarily have a record of that consent. It's very difficult to just say because someone has walked into the building, they've consented to their face being scanned and that data being used for whatever purposes you've tried to put on the terms and conditions. So that's an issue. The alternative is where you have a data protection law that allows you to collect data for a legitimate use. Certainly the GDPR would allow this in certain circumstances. What would count as a legitimate use? You could say, for example, facial recognition to restrict entry and exit into a building where there needs to be a high level of security. It's fairly legitimate use depending what you're doing with the data later. But what if it's just to try and sell someone more product in a mall? What if it's just to collect that facial recognition data, link it together to make it some valuable data you can sell to someone? Almost certainly that's not a legitimate use. Almost certainly you need consent. So you need to think very carefully about why you're collecting the data and what it's going to be used for. The next thing is, what's that data? What will happen to that data after it's collected? Now, you may remember a few years ago there was an app that was going all around social media where you could essentially take your face and turn it into a cutesy Japanese-style anime character, and everyone was taking photos of themselves, doing that, uploading them, showing them on Facebook and wherever, not realizing that what they were actually doing was uploading a picture of their face to a database to a company somewhere else in the world without ever checking what they would do with that data. Now, I actually met someone from that company who said that they have one of the largest collections of facial data in the world and that it is incredibly valuable to marketeers, in terms of research, even to the medical industry. So do they have a right to use that data? Were people consenting? They almost certainly were, because they were clicking terms and conditions when they were uploading their pictures. But what can you do with that data, and would the law intervene? Well, it's going to depend where you are. I would say that if you're in some jurisdictions, there's a big elephant in the room. If your facial data is collected, then you have no idea what it'll be used for, and you can't really stop that. But in the EU, if you think that data's been collected on, you could ask to see what it is. You could ask for it to be deleted. You could ask for it to be corrected. Suppose you go and get a nose job and your face doesn't look the same anymore. You could ask for that to be corrected. You contact the data protection officer. But would you necessarily know who has collected your data? Possibly not. It is quite difficult. So it's reliant on those using the technology to be responsible, to actually look at the laws, not try and it's not really a legal term, but not try and pull a fast one, not try and hoodwink a consumer, hoodwink someone's facial identity. And then when they've got that data, in terms of what they do with it, are they going to sell it on? If you're using facial recognition tech purely to create monetize a way of selling data, essentially doing what everyone accuses Facebook of doing all of the time, just saying, oh, people give their data willfully, and then it just uses a massive marketing tool, which may or may not be true. I'm not going to go into that here. You need to be upfront about what you're doing. Now, I'll be honest with you, to be perfectly honest, most people will take convenience over their data privacy. There was a good case in China last year where someone who was a member of a zoo complained that facial recognition data was being used at the zoo. And he was like, well, why do you need to scan my face? Why do you need to collect data about what I look like when I'm going to the zoo? And that went to the courts there, and that's slowly rattling through. We're waiting to see what the outcome is as to whether that's just going too far. But I think you need to be a responsible business, because the law, frankly, isn't really with facial recognition yet. GDPR is the closest to it. Yeah, as I said, it will be classed most likely, if it's not just personal data, it would fall under the biometric aspect. But if you are not responsible with it, then almost certainly you'll find that the law catches up, and like a large club, it bashes you over the head and says it's no longer allowed. You will find more jurisdictions restricting or banning outright the use of facial recognition. Now, is it a good thing? Are we going to live in an Orwellian state where everyone's face is monitored and they can track you? Will we have, I mentioned this on earlier podcasts, drones that take a scan of your face, and when they see you, they hunt you down like something from the Terminator? Are we going to be essentially in Minority Report, another movie that I mentioned not too long ago? Are we facing the tech dystopia that we've been promised by sci-fi writers for ages? Well, to be honest, I would hope not. I still think that people are fairly circumspect about how this technology is used, and I think that the consumer, the individual, the non-legally educated, non-lawyer person, the non-tech savvy person is becoming increasingly aware on how their data is used, and facial data is one of those too. However, when it comes to a state using it, a state will set its own laws, and a state can do what it wants. So if you're in a jurisdiction where you don't know the law and your face is being scanned, who knows where it's going to end up? Maybe you'll end up being the poster boy for some sort of new product. You never know. It'll be certainly cheaper than hiring an expensive model. The future, though, facial recognition is going to explode. It's already being found in more and more elements of consumer tech. In terms of medical tech is being used. We're seeing it in the infrastructure sector. You can monitor a worker walking around a site, and if they look as if they're in risk, you can record that, and it will hopefully cut down on accidents, on safety risks. The thing is, you've just got to be careful how it's used, that you don't abuse it, that you don't think that, well, like any data collecting tool, this is something we can use with free reign rather than free will. Also remember that there's always a rush when a new technology is developed, when something seems like it's the answer to all of our problems, that you will just allow it to collect any data we want, almost because the solution is better than the downsides to what you're doing. Well, you need to be very aware of that, and I think companies are. Personally, I love facial recognition tech as long as it's used correctly. I do read the terms and conditions. I'm one of those boring people who looks at what's happening with my data. And I do think that as the world gets more aware of the importance of personal data, the value of it, so the consumer, the individual realizes the value of their data rather than the large organization that is harvesting, then we'll find some controls. I do think we will see more laws to deal specifically with facial recognition tech in some jurisdictions. Those who value privacy will lead the way, and I think the rest of the world will catch up. But I do think it's exciting stuff. And frankly, I have to admit it, I said, would I balance convenience versus losing my data? The convenience aspect is pretty compelling. No longer will I be locked out of my apartment because I left my keys in the office. No longer will I be unable to get into the office because I left my passes at home. No longer will I have to go out, realize I've forgotten to take some money or a credit card. I really am a very forgetful person in this respect, and I'll be able to use my face to pay for things instead. I just hope that when I do that, it's not linking my face to some massive database that says this person just bought a massive packet of mini eggs, which I may have done recently because Easter is not that far away. Anyway, that's it for this week. If you've got any topics you would like to cover, and you've got any specific questions on, please do get in touch. It's paul.haswell@pinsentmasons.com. Most importantly of all, though, whether you're excited about facial recognition tech, whether you're watching sci-fi movies that show a future where we're all being monitored at our every move, most importantly of all, please do stay safe. Actually, digressing slightly, this week saw the release of a hugely anticipated video game, Half-Life Alyx, which is one of the VR killer apps. And that's set in a dystopian future where you're basically monitored by cameras everywhere you go, which may have gave me the impetus to record this particular podcast. Anyway, as I said, hope you're all staying safe. Make sure you stay indoors. Make sure that you don't panic. That's the most important thing of all. And I will be back again with something else next week. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.